Well, good morning. Good to see so many people out this morning. I want to welcome our visitors. We're happy that you have chosen to be with us this morning, and all those who have found our live stream on our YouTube channel, we're happy that you've tuned in as well. This morning's lesson is entitled, A Friend Closer Than a Brother, Jonathan. This lesson is by request. I am starting to go through my request list. So if you have a request, now would be a good time to get it to me so I can add it to the list. I'm starting to work through them in this new year. And so this lesson comes to us by a request. And our text is going to be 1 Samuel 18, 1-5. We're going to look at several different passages throughout the life of Jonathan, but I think this passage serves to show us just how close he and David became as friends. The scripture reading for us, I want to thank Randy for reading that and begin there again this morning. In Proverbs 17:17 and 18:24, it says, A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Solomon must have known a little something about sibling rivalry, didn't he? But he says, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. He later says in chapter 18, verse 24, A man of too many friends comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Friendship is a valuable thing. I remember growing up, there was an old saying that we used to hear. It said, you can choose your friends, but you can't pick your family. And so friends were an important part of life. It was important that we chose the right friends. As we were younger, my parents would take a hand in that. If we would bring friends over, and I remember sometimes they would say, they would recognize a like mind or kindred spirit, and they'd say, you need to invite them over more often. You need to do more things with them. And then I remember them saying, that kid's nothing but trouble. Have as little to do with that guy as possible. Or, as I got into my teens, that girl is trouble. Have nothing to do with her. And then other times, you need to get closer to that girl or get to know that one better or that friend. And as I look back in my life, it seems like I had friends in what I called seasons. As a Navy brat, we moved every so often. Every so either 3.5, 4 years, we were moving. And it seems like I would stay in contact with those friends for a little bit, but then I made new friends in the new area, and then I'd move and I kept up with those friends for a little bit. And then around 2006, Facebook happened, and all of a sudden I'm being inundated with friend requests from people I hadn't heard from in 20 years. And they're saying, hey, we still want to get in touch. And so I've been in touch with a lot of people throughout my childhood. But when I look back at my friends, it seems like the ones that have really stuck out with me, the ones that I've stayed in contact with the most, have been in the brotherhood. Someone that's of like mind and like faith. And we're going to certainly see that with David and Jonathan. But have you ever had a friend that you considered at some point in your life, or maybe now, closer than a family member, closer than a sibling? When I was in my early 20s, I met such a man, and he and I it seemed like from the day we met, I felt like David and Jonathan, our souls were knit together. And we were inseparable. We called each other brother, and it was more than just because we were both Christians. For a time, there was several years in my life that I was closer to him and did more things with him and knew more about him than I knew about my own brothers. But then time and distance separated us, and when he came and visited us the summer before we left Alaska, and it was like we picked right up where we were, like no time had passed at all. And we just had that kind of relationship. And so when I read through 1 Samuel, starting in chapter 18, and we look at how David and Jonathan were such good friends, I can't help but think back in my own life of the friends that I've had, the friends that have been there for me when I was in trouble, the friends that I leaned on, the friends who leaned on me, who came to me and I was their call in that middle of the night. And so as we go through this study, I want you to be relating to those types of friendships in your life. To think about the friends that you have had and the friends that and the people that you look for in a friend, the things that you look for in a friend, as we look at the friendship of David and Jonathan. To have a friend that shares our ideals and morals is an encouragement to us that we can't even describe. Because it's someone that we can lean on their strength when we're weak. They lean on us when they are weak. To have the right kind of friend is important. Faith and strength of character are examples we find in the Old Testament that are there for us to study and to live our lives by. Romans 15:4 says, "For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope." So the New Testament's telling us, while we are no longer under the law of Moses, there are a lot of beneficial things that we can go back into the Old Testament and read and glean for our understanding and our hope. And certainly as we dive into our study this morning, we're going to find examples of friendship in the Old Testament. And again, Proverbs 17:17, "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. A man of too many friends comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother." And I wonder, as Solomon was writing these words, if he thought about the friendship between his father and Jonathan, or if it's just a coincidence that we can look at David and Jonathan and see friends as Solomon was writing about. Solomon was writing from a point of wisdom. And so as we look at the friends around our own lives, the friends we've had, the friends we have now, the friends we hope to make as our life continues, these words of wisdom stick with us and tell us that sometimes our friendships are even more value than our family. David had such a friend in Jonathan, King Saul's son and the crown prince of Israel. And I want to state at the very beginning here what my true thoughts of Jonathan are. Jonathan was an amazing man. And we only get a small glimpse into his life. And I don't know about you, but maybe by the end of this you'll be like me and say, I wish there was more written about Jonathan. I want to know more about him after we study him. But we just get a small glimpse into his life. And Jonathan's one of those rare characters in the Bible that no sins or faults are recorded. And it doesn't mean that he was perfect. It doesn't mean he was sinless. It means that the Scriptures don't record them because they hold him in contrast to the very many sins of his father. And lets us see the contrast of a man that came from a home with a father such as Saul and all his many faults and sins. And yet Jonathan stands as a shining example of faith and virtue and courage. And maybe that's why his sins were overlooked by the Holy Spirit, to show a contrast of a son and his father. But we're going to see by studying Jonathan that not only is it important for us to pick our friends wisely, but that we must be a true friend to others. And so I want to look at Jonathan's courage. We're going to look in 1 Samuel 14 and verse 6. This is one of the first places that we are introduced to Jonathan. We get introduced to him in chapter 13. But we're going to be introduced to the kind of man that he was here starting in verse 6 of 1 Samuel 14. It says, "Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, 'Come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few.'" So I want you to be thinking of those words of Jonathan when we get to 1 Samuel 14, as we back up a little bit to see who he is in chapter 13. In chapter 13, we're introduced to the battle at Geba with the Philistines. And so Prince Jonathan stands out in Israel as a man of valor. He's the son of Saul. We know that from 1 Samuel 13:22. If you go back to 1 Samuel 13, 1-2, and because of the nature of this lesson, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. There's some passages we're going to read and others I'm going to summarize, such as the chapter of 1 Samuel 13. In verses 1-2, we find he's the right hand to his father Saul, Israel's first king. He is a leader of a third of Saul's forces. Saul had 3,000 men with him at Geba, and Jonathan commands 1,000. He is a valiant warrior, we're told in verses 3 and 4. He strikes down a Philistine garrison in Geba. And we're not given any details about that. And so nothing really stands out about Jonathan from that. He's a man of valor. There's been a lot of men in valor in the Scriptures, both good and bad. So it doesn't really tell us anything about his character other than that he is courageous. But he's also got 1,000 men at his back. The Philistines, they didn't care for that. And so they rouse an army of 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and we're told an innumerable army, 1 Samuel 13, verse 5. In response to Jonathan's 1,000 men attacking and slaying a Philistine garrison, the Philistines rise up with 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and an innumerable army. So we're not even told the number of the foot soldiers, just the cavalry the chariots and the horsemen. So 36,000 are in number, 3,000 are with Saul. They outnumber the Israelites over 10-1, just from the number we're given, but then says an innumerable army. Saul is outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched. So the Israelites scatter. They hide in hills, they hide in caves, they run into the forest, they cross the Jordan into Gad and Gilead. And so we find at the end of chapter 13, Saul stays in Gilgal, waiting for the prophet Samuel to arrive as appointed earlier. And we're introduced to Saul's first sin. In verses 8 to 10, Saul waited 7 days for Samuel. And we can understand from Saul's point of view, this is a dire situation. The Philistines have roused an innumerable army against them. Saul's got 3,000 guys, or he did. They scattered and fled and are in hiding. Who knows how many are still with Jonathan and how many are with Saul? They have fled into the hills and caves and in the forest. So Samuel tells Saul, wait for me and I'll bring you a word from God. And so Saul waits a full week at Gilgal. In the meantime, the Philistines are just growing stronger. Finally, after waiting 7 days, Saul's tired of waiting for Samuel, and he burns incense on an altar before the Lord. Saul was a Benjamite, not a Levite. And I don't think it's coincidence that right as he's doing that, who should appear but Samuel, the true priest, the true prophet and judge of Israel. And so here comes Samuel, and he rebukes him and prophesies against Saul's kingdom. In verses 11 to 14, it reads this. 1 Samuel 13, 11 to 14. Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Saul made a mistake. And already, God says, your kingdom's not going to endure. I'm seeking out a man after my own heart. And so Samuel departs and he leaves Saul at Geba with Jonathan and 600 men. They went from 3,000 to 600. Now they're really outnumbered. The Israelites were without swords except Saul and Jonathan due to Philistine raids. We're told that in 1 Samuel 13, 19 to 23. And at the end of that chapter, the Philistines are camped at Michmash, just on the other side of a steep ravine separating the two camps. They are so close to death, the Israelites are. The Philistines are just on the other side of a ravine, and Saul only has 600 guys with him. They are not going to stand against 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and an innumerable army. But then we read of Jonathan, chapter 14, Jonathan's faith and courage. Jonathan leaves the camp. So we know that they went from 3,000 men down to 600, and now we're going to read of just 2. Jonathan takes his armor bearer with him. You remember in chapter 17 when David goes against Goliath, and we often think of it's just the 2 of them on the field, but we read that Goliath had an armor bearer. So there's really a third guy on the field who's not there to fight. Jonathan has an armor bearer. So this is a guy carrying his arms in armor that are too heavy for Jonathan to wear. And so when the time comes, this guy would help strap on any extra things that Jonathan needed. So Jonathan leaves the camp with his armor bearer. He crosses over to the Philistines' encampment, and Saul doesn't know that he left. And Jonathan's faith allowed him to use the words perhaps. Remember what he said to his armor bearer? Let's go up against this Philistine garrison. And if the Lord wills, perhaps he will be with us. He did not place on his own time. He didn't place God on his own timetable. He said, if perhaps God will work something good through us. And I can't help but think of James 4:15 that says, as we make plans, we ought to say, if the Lord wills. We certainly see that here in Jonathan's planning. If perhaps. And then Jonathan tells his armor bearer, he says, here's the plan. If they come out to us, God's not with us, we're going to run. But if they say, come up to us, means they hesitate, it shows weakness. Jonathan says, then God's with us. And we will certainly go up, and God will give them into our hands. We're starting to see the type of man Jonathan is, and already see the contrast between him and his father Saul. And so Jonathan's courage of faith along with an earthquake in 1 Samuel 14:15, showed that God was with him. The Philistines said, "Come up here and we'll tell you something." Jonathan looks at his armor bearer and says, "God's given him into our hands." It's an amazing passage. No hesitation on Jonathan's part. And his armor bearer says, "I'm with you. My fate is your fate. Whatever is good in your heart to do, I will be there with you." So the two of them, showing God was with them, the enemy is confused, and Jonathan goes up and kills 20 men with his armor bearer. And it delivers a great blow. The Philistines don't know how it happened, who did it. This confusion goes through, an earthquake happens, and then Saul's forces, even with the men who had hidden themselves, they get courage from the earthquake and the rousing battle cry of Jonathan, his garrison, and they chase this innumerable army out of Michmash. It's amazing what God did with two guys, because one guy had the courage and faith to say, if perhaps God is with us, if the Lord wills. But then the rest of chapter 14, Saul gives a very foolish, we might even say stupid order. He says, no one can eat until the Philistines are defeated. And I like to, when Brother Norman Eva's in my classes, I like to point at him. He was an Army quartermaster, and I have Brother Chuck with me this morning. He was an Army quartermaster. And so I like to look at our quartermasters and say, what does an army need to be strong in the field? Food. An army runs on its stomach. When we read these things and we see Saul says no one's going to eat until they're defeated, you just killed your army because you weakened them. How are they going to be strong to fight? And so we read under the penalty of death, chapter 14, verse 24, Jonathan recognized his father's faults as a ruler. He says that's a stupid order, and he eats honey despite that fact. And then there's a great slaughter of the Philistines. But then later, Saul finds out that Jonathan ate some honey, and he's willing to put Jonathan to death. And it shows just how popular a prince and a commander Jonathan was, because the people spared him from Saul's wrath. They said, oh no, you're not putting Jonathan to death. And you could just imagine his 1,000 men standing in front of the prince. You're going through us first. And so Saul spares Jonathan's life as they talk sense into him. Jonathan gave himself up to die. In verse 43, he says, all right, if that's the penalty, that's the penalty. Go ahead. And his men said, oh no. In verse 45, his men said, but the people said to Saul, must Jonathan die, who's brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Far from it, as the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Did you see how they recognized how this battle went? 3,000 guys, unorganized, hiding in caves, forests, and hills, and then coming when Jonathan rouses the troops, and they fight back in innumerable force. They recognized this wasn't just our courage. Jonathan worked with God and brought about this great salvation. And so they talk sense into Saul. But I just like this passage here in chapter 14. Jonathan realized that if God is on your side, a lack of human or material resources is not a factor or an obstacle. And I'm reminded of Romans 8:31 at this point. If God is for us, who is against us? Jonathan said, God saves not by many or by few. God does it his own way. He was with Jonathan and his armor bearer. They slew 20 guys, and then God caused an earthquake. And the Philistines had no idea what happened. They lost 20 guys, but 20 guys out of an innumerable force. But then with the earthquake, and then Israel raising a battle cry, there was mass confusion, and they went on the run. There's an application here for us today. We're called to take steps of faith, bold steps of faith, trusting in God's ability to overcome obstacles. And when the smoke clears, we are told to stand firm. In Ephesians 10 and Ephesians 6, verse 10 says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God. And then later in verse 13, it says you put on the full armor of God so that you might stand. And the picture there is when the smoke clears, the soldier of God stands. And we certainly see that as we read in these early days of Jonathan and who he was. Our courage can inspire others to act in faith and confidence. Jesus said this about our lights in Matthew 5:16. Let your lights shine before men so that they might see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Others might see how you behave and your conduct, and they will glorify God for you, because of you and what they've seen in you. I certainly see in this passage in chapter 14, Jonathan inspires this demoralized, beleaguered group that had fled and splintered. Jonathan brings them all back, and God works through them to bring about salvation from the Philistines at Michmash. Let us have faith and courage to trust in God as Jonathan did, no matter what we face, and realize that we are stronger when we're not alone, that we're stronger when we're together, we're stronger when we work with God and not against God. Next, I want to talk about Jonathan's friendship with David. The next time we're really introduced to Jonathan is in chapter 18. Chapter 15, and I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit, about Saul's second sin and what that did to Jonathan. But in chapter 15 is the battle with the Amalekites. Chapter 16, because of what happens in chapter 15, Samuel goes to Bethel and meets Jesse and his sons and anoints someone new as king. And then we have the account with the battle with Goliath in chapter 17. And then we are introduced to Jonathan. And so here is right on the heels of David conquering Goliath and the army chasing down the Philistines. And David is talking to Saul. It says, now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And so we start seeing the beginning of David's popularity. But as we read this passage and read of Saul's friendship with David, I want us to go back a little bit in time in chapter 15 and see what's happened to Jonathan's future and status as crown prince of Israel. We're going to look at Saul's second sin, which is found in 1 Samuel 15, 1-9. God told Samuel an ancient fulfillment of an ancient prophecy from the time of Moses. The Israelites encountered the Amalekites, and God said that the Amalekites would one day be completely cut off. But it didn't happen in the time of the judges. It didn't happen in the conquest. Now that Israel has a king, they have a strong army. They've defeated the Philistines, at least at the battle of Geba and Michmash. And so now God says to Saul, you are to gather the army and utterly wipe out the Amalekites, men, women, children, and their animals. No trace, to fulfill the prophecy made way back when. And Saul disobeys God. And Samuel arrives, and Saul is all pleased with himself. And Saul makes excuses. Well, I was afraid of the people. The people kept animals. They wanted to sacrifice. Look, I brought the king. The bottom line is Samuel tells him his kingdom is torn away from him and given to his neighbor who is better than him. In verse 28. What does that mean for the house of Saul? God had said in chapter 13, I would have established your kingdom forever. But as it is, I'm seeking a man after my own heart. Then in chapter 15, with his second sin, God sends Samuel and says, the kingdom is torn away from you. And I'm giving it to a man, your neighbor, who is better than you. According to God's plan, Jonathan is no longer crown prince of Israel. Now physically, as Saul lives and the people see, Jonathan is the crown prince. But at this point, as we're reading, as we're students of the Bible, reading just cover to cover, and we don't know the rest of the story, we know at this point in time, Jonathan's rule is in jeopardy. Because God just said he tore the kingdom from the house of Saul. The man whom God anointed to take the kingdom from Saul, we learn in 1 Samuel 16, verse 13, is David. He's a shepherd. In fact, he was of so little consequence that when Jesse was ordered to bring his sons before Samuel, he left David in the field. And Samuel has to ask, do you have any other kids? Well, yeah, the runt of the litter, but he's out in the fields. He's with my sheep. And Samuel says, we're not going to proceed until he arrives. So they send for David. He comes, and we know the story. Samuel anoints him there at Bethel in front of all those who were witnesses, including his father and his brothers. So we come to chapter 18. Chapter 16, David is anointed. We now know who the man after God's own heart is, the neighbor who is better than Saul. It is David, a shepherd. We see this shepherd start becoming a name in chapter 17 as he comes down to check on his brothers, and he sees Goliath, the Philistine champion of Gath, this giant, and he is taunting the army of God. He's blaspheming for 40 days. And David says, who is this guy? Why are you allowing this for 40 days? He says, I'm stopping this now. And so they brought him before Saul because no one else had stepped up. The challenge was one-on-one combat would settle the war. And we don't read of Jonathan stepping in the ring. We don't read of Saul, who is head and shoulders taller than every other man. We don't read of him stepping in and taking it on. His son Jonathan, who's already proven himself one of faith and courage and a valiant man of war, Jonathan doesn't step in the ring. For 40 days, they listen to this challenge. And then in comes the runt of the litter of Jesse, the shepherd boy, a youth not counted for military service. So we know he's at least younger than 20. And he comes and Saul says, when he tells Saul, I'm a shepherd, I've killed the bear, I've killed the lion. Goliath's no better than the bear and the lion. God is going to give him into my hands just as he did the bear and the lion. Saul says, go with God. And so David goes out and he fells the giant. And then after witnessing David take down the Philistine giant and champion of Gath, Goliath, we are told that Jonathan loved David as himself. Their souls were knit together, and they made a covenant together. And so it's the first covenant. And because I have the numerator there, it's the first. You're going to see there's a few covenants that they make with each other. And we're not given the details of this covenant. But whatever it is, they had this friendship, and they made a covenant together before God. This was a mark of tremendous confidence in David. Jonathan, he is the prince. And upon this young shepherd boy, he gives him the robe off his back, his armor, his bow, his sword. Do you remember at the end of chapter 13 how many swords were in Israel? 2. But it's possible at this point, because of the great slaughter of the Philistines and plunders of war, there might be more swords than just the 2 now. But the prince gives this shepherd boy his personal sword, his bow, and his armor and his belt. This is an amazing gift when you think about it. The little boy that was left in the field because he was so little consequence in his own family's eyes. Samuel anoints as king, and he demonstrates before the entire nation what a shepherd leader looks like. A shepherd jumps in the way of the danger to protect the sheep. David sees the giant as no better than the bear or the lion that came after his father's sheep. And already he's acting like a shepherd. And he takes on that giant. And God is with him. And Jonathan sees that, and we can just imagine, as Jonathan told his armor bearer, let's go up just the 2 of us against these Philistines. I can just imagine Jonathan saying, yes! That's the guy I want as a friend. And their souls are knit together. They make a covenant, and he bestows on David these beautiful gifts. Jonathan's love for David did not include jealousy of any kind, despite David's triumph and growing popularity, as we start seeing in verses 5 to 9. I'm reminded of Romans 12:10, where Paul said, give preference to one another in honor. Jonathan saw a warrior spirit in this young boy. And he said, that is my kind of man. And so a friendship blossomed. An application for us today. True friendship involves sacrifice and putting others' needs above our own. Jesus said this in John 15:13. Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. We certainly see that attitude in a shepherd. Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd, John chapter 10. In John chapter 18, he says, I lay down my life for the sheep. David took his life in his own hands to step into the ring with Goliath because David was a shepherd. Jonathan recognized that. Building relationships based on mutual respect and loyalty reflects God's love. Jesus said this in John 15:12, this is my commandment that you love one another just as I have loved you. He doesn't put any conditions on it. The qualifier is as I have loved you. So then we have to look at the qualifier. How did Jesus love? Selflessly, self-sacrificially, and unconditionally. That's the kind of love we're to give one another. We are to forgive one another. We are to love one another. How do we react when we realize another Christian is more talented in a certain area than ourselves? I always thought before I was given the chance to preach, I always thought, and I've told you this before, I thought my one gift that I had, the one ability I had, was I wasn't afraid of talking in public, so I could do prayers, I could lead on the Lord's table, but one of the things that scared me to death the most that I ever did was song lead. I was so afraid. What if I have a cold, my throat is scratchy? What if I'm off key? Sometimes I was off key. What about this? What about that? And what if my hand motions are off? Usually what I was told is my hand motions were right. They were just too fast. And so I had all these self-conscious things, but I thought that was my one gift, my one ability. And so I wanted to do it to the best of my ability. I was just a song leader. And I was okay. I knew there were lots of other people who could read the music better than me. They knew the hand motions better than me. And I was okay with that. But I remember there was a workshop type class. I don't know what to call it. I don't remember what they called it. So best title I can come to my mind is a workshop. That there were all these younger men and older men. And they come together and they said, we want to learn how to lead singing. And this guy from another congregation had been invited to come and teach the song leading to these guys. And I remember being impressed and said, yeah, I want to be like that. That was how I looked at it. I want to be like that. You know, that's what the practice I want to put into it. But I knew two other guys who after the class were in the back talking, and I walked up, and one of them was a friend of mine, and they said, that guy is so good, I'm never going to be that good. I'm telling them to take me off the roster. I will not song lead after hearing that guy because I'm not that good. And they were bitter and jealous, and I tried talking them out of such a folly because we needed song leaders. And these were two of them. And they said, after hearing that guy do it, I'm not that good. I'm not going to do it. We've known people like that in our lives, whether it's a coworker or a classmate or a family member. Jonathan could have said, man, I wasn't courageous enough to get in the ring with Goliath. This little guy did. And so I'm giving him all my implements of war because I'm hanging it up. I'm just not going to be a warrior anymore. That's not what Jonathan did. He didn't give that up. He said, I'm going to encourage that. That's what we need to be like. How do we react when we realize someone is more talented in certain areas than us? Do we react with jealousy, with bitterness? Or do we encourage and tell them, that was wonderful, that was awesome, I want to work and be like you one day? How do we react when a brother or sister has reached a level of faith beyond that of our own? We see them react to something and we didn't react that way. We reacted poorly, and we see them react in a way that exemplifies Christ. Do we let jealousy and bitterness creep in, or do we say, I want to encourage that and tell them what an example they were to me? Do we try to find fault in them, to discredit their faith or their ability? Some people do that. I'm reminded of Daniel 6. The satraps and commissioners of the Medo-Persian government found out that Daniel, who is already one of the top 3, was then going to be promoted to an extra position that was just below the king. And so they started looking for fault in Daniel. They looked at his business life and his home life. And when they couldn't find anything in those matters, they turned to his faith. And Daniel ultimately was sentenced to death by the lion's den. Their jealousy nearly got Daniel killed. But God was with Daniel. We know the rest of that story in verses 21 to 22 of Daniel 6. We as Christians are told that we have different talents. We're told how to use them and how to treat one another as God wishes us to in Romans 12, 3 through 8. Jonathan didn't resent the greatness he saw in David, but rather he admired it. He loved David because he loved the qualities that David manifested: faith, courage, humility, total dependence upon God. And the two of them were alike. They were of like mind and like spirit. And so their souls were knit together. How we handle the success of others is a great test of our own character. Do we encourage that? Or do we try to find fault and bring them down a peg, as the idiom goes? How do we react? Jonathan reacted in the right way. He loved David. He admired David and cultivated that friendship. And in fact, more than a friendship, we also see there is loyalty there. True biblical love rejoices in a godly character. True biblical love rejoices in a godly character. We ought to encourage one another as we see one another in faith and in talent and ability and using those things to bring praise and worship to God. But more than a friend, Jonathan displayed loyalty. So we're going to talk about Jonathan's loyalty to David. In 1 Samuel 20, 14 to 17. This is the second covenant between David and Jonathan. And Jonathan says, if I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies. Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. The reason this becomes so important as the loyalty that Jonathan shows to David is in 1 Samuel 6, 1 to 6. Saul gives the command to kill David, and Jonathan defends David. Why? What has he done? Even telling Saul, who was really behind the victories over their enemies, God, and that God was with David. He's saying, what has David done? God is the true force behind our victories, and God is with David. So if you want to kill David, you're really going against God. Jonathan tells his own father that in defense of his friend. Then he says, why? What has he done? Reminded of, not that it was a friend, but Pilate said the same thing. When the Jews said, crucify, crucify, Pilate said, why? What has he done? Jonathan's at the same point. Why is the sentence of death on my friend, your son-in-law, my brother-in-law, and the captain of one of your 1,000 men? Why is the sentence of death on him? Because Saul was petty and he was jealous. So we see the second covenant made between David and Jonathan in chapter 20, verses 14 to 17. Jonathan put himself in jeopardy to warn David of a plot of his father's to kill David, and he sent him out of the country. This happens in 2 Samuel 20, verses 1 all the way through 29. First, he'd asked David to show him kindness when David was king. This clearly shows that Jonathan knew that David had been anointed king. Again, as we talk about, especially when we get to 1 Samuel 25, this is a well-known common knowledge among the people that Samuel anointed David. Jonathan knows it, and Jonathan knows that he's going to be king over Israel and not himself. Jonathan knows he's no longer the crown prince. And do you see that he's okay with it? As we read that covenant in verses 14 to 17, he says, you will be king. And later on in chapter 23, he's going to say to David, and we're going to look at this in that third and last covenant they make with each other, you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul, my father, knows that also. Jonathan tells David, you will be king. And if I'm alive, show kindness to my house. He swore fealty and became David's first subject as king. Did you catch that part? Jonathan, David's not king yet. And Jonathan already, in his mind, is David's first subject. He swore fealty to David. You will be king, and I will be next to you. That's an amazing friend that Jonathan was to David. Jonathan knew the custom of the day was to put to death all the royal descendants of the previous monarchy when there was a change of dynasty. That's how it was in the eastern nations. And he made David promise to show kindness to his house forever, even after God cut off all of David's enemies. Jonathan saying, you need to remember me. We've made a covenant together. So Saul argues with Jonathan that David was a threat to his chances of being the next king. This is in 1 Samuel 20, 31 to 34. He says in verse 31, "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he must surely die." Saul basically tells him David is a threat to your earthly success. Jonathan refused to think in earthly terms. He defends David, and his own father Saul, after telling him that, tries to kill him with a spear. We see that in verses 32 to 34. So Jonathan knows just how dead set Saul is against killing David, and he goes and warns him and sends him out of the country. David goes on the run. By the time we get to the end of chapter 20, David is on the run, is going to be treated as an outlaw for the rest of the book of 1 Samuel. And so we come to a very bittersweet passage in my mind. Jonathan and David's third covenant is found in 1 Samuel 23, 15 to 18. We don't have time to read it this morning, but I really encourage you to if you haven't looked at it in a while, and this is why. Jonathan comes to David in the forest of Ziph at Horesh when Saul was pursuing David. It is the last time that these two friends would meet in this life. It is the very last time these friends will be together. And so Jonathan comes to where David was hiding from Saul, and we're told in verse 16 he's there to encourage him in God. Again, reminding us of Jonathan's faith. He and David were of like mind and spirit. And he was fully aware of David's future destiny. More than that, he had sad foresight of the fate of his own house. And yet, in view of it all, he believingly submitted to the will of God and lovingly clung to his friend. What he did say to David, there is in verse 17, where he says, "You will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you, and my father knows that also." Jonathan saying, "You will be king, and I'll be your right-hand man." Jonathan was happy for that. He was content with being second best, if you will. No jealousy, no bitterness. He could have easily, if he was ambitious and wanted the crown, he knew where David was. He could have told Saul, and the army could have come crashing down on him. But Jonathan went in secret to where David was in hiding in this forest of Ziph. And he encouraged him in God. Verse 16. Verse 17, he says, "You're going to be king. I'm going to be your right-hand man." And then in verse 18, he reminds him of their covenant. Jonathan was already heir to the throne, yet he stationed himself second to David. David was closer to Jonathan than even his own brothers. God hadn't chosen Jonathan to be king, even though we see in Jonathan a great example of faithfulness and courage. He was not God's pick. And Jonathan didn't dwell on why God hadn't chosen him. Jonathan was content with his lot in life. He says, "I'm going to be next to you," meaning I'll be your right-hand man. And I'm happy for that. And God wasn't going to physically reward him for doing the right thing. And we'll talk about that in the next section. There's an application for today. How many of us are prepared to serve God faithfully, even if such service results in personal hardships with very little, if any, physical rewards? There's a lot of people today who buy into the prosperity gospel. Just call on God, do the right things, and God's going to reward you with boats and mansions and cars and lots of money. God's never promised that. And here, there's no better example than looking at the life of Jonathan to see that play out. Jonathan did everything right, and we're going to talk about that a little later. Jonathan made all the right moves, and yet God did not choose him to be king. Satan once told God that Job was merely serving God because of the physical benefits in Job 1, 9 to 11. Satan's inference is that no human being would ever think to serve God without expecting something physical in return. What Satan was saying about Job is everyone has a price. Isn't that a phrase we hear today? Everyone has a price. And people are surprised when you can't be bought because of your morals and your ethics and your faith in God. Job could not be bought, and Satan found that out. Jonathan is an exception. He could not be bought. He did not let pride hinder his loyalty and friendship with David. He accepted second best. Loyalty in our relationships means standing by others even in difficult times. Remember that what it says in Proverbs 17:17? A friend loves at all times. You have your brother for adversity, but you have your friends to lean on when those times get tough because your friend loves you at all times. We can act as peacemakers advocating for what is right and seeking reconciliation. Jonathan was acting as a peacemaker and put himself in danger with his own father. His father tried to pin him to the wall with a spear because he said, "Why? What has he done?" He has brought victory after victory because God is with him. Jesus said in Matthew 5:9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." We see in Jonathan a friend who is a peacemaker. He tried to smooth things over. In fact, he argues with David earlier on in chapter 20 that, "No, my father doesn't want to kill you." And David goes, "Oh, he most certainly does." Jonathan says, "No, why? What have you done?" And then Jonathan goes to dinner and finds out, "Oh, yeah, no, my father really does want to kill you. You need to get out of town." And he sends David out. Jonathan was a peacemaker. We ought to be that way. We ought to do what we can to encourage others and lift one another up. That's what Jonathan did in the very last moment that we see him and David together on this side of life. He's there to encourage him in God. It's an amazing story when we look at the life and the friendship that Jonathan and David had. But it brings us to our sad conclusion, and that is Jonathan and his father, 1 Samuel chapter 31. In verses 1 to 2, it says, "Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel. And the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul." Jonathan's death by the Philistines on Mount Gilboa here in chapter 31, 1 to 2. To a student of the Bible, as we're reading it cover to cover and we don't know the end, this is shocking. I would say from a human point of view, we're not prepared for this ending. Jonathan made all the right moves. He displayed godly attitude. His motives were right. He made tremendous sacrifices, and yet he wasn't God's choice for king. And in fact, his fate was here to die in battle with his father and brothers in a futile war that God used Samuel one last time from the grave. Samuel arose as a ghost and told Saul, "If you go to battle tomorrow, you will die, you and your sons in the army." And Saul went anyway. Jonathan did everything right, and yet he died in the prime of his life. He was a godly man. He was a courageous warrior with a bright future. Yet God allowed sinners to kill him in this fruitless, futile battle on Mount Gilboa. We don't know all the reasons why God allowed such a good man to die young. But Jonathan was prepared to accept such a destiny. You might remember that we read earlier in 1 Samuel 20, verse 14. Jonathan says, "If I am still alive, you will show kindness to my house." Jonathan was prepared for whatever fate had in store for him. The question is, are we? Can we have that kind of faith in God as Jonathan did? That I'm ready to accept whatever fate God has in store for me? Or am I ready to accept that? Jonathan was fiercely loyal to David, but I would also point out his loyalty to his father, who he recognized had faults and sin. This fateful morning, as the army of Israel got up and assembled for battle on Mount Gilboa, Jonathan strapped on his armor, put on his sword, and strapped his bow and arrows over his back, armed his armor bearer, and went out to battle for one last time. Jonathan continued to respect the office that Saul held, not only as king and commander, but also his father. He strapped on his armor that day, and he went to die with his father. You know, we live in a day and age when people often try to get out of a relationship or a commitment at the first sign of trouble. In fact, we don't see that at all in Jonathan, do we? Anytime there was trouble, he ran to it. He never ran from it. And so we can understand why this particular day, when Israel was going to battle, why Jonathan didn't stay home where it would have been safe. Because Jonathan was a warrior. Jonathan had faith in God. He was courageous and he was loyal. We live in a day and time when people try to get out of things at first sign of trouble. Jonathan knew that God was no longer with Saul or his house, that he was with David. And yet Jonathan went to war. Later on in 2 Samuel 1 and verse 23, David's going to say, Saul and Jonathan in their death were not parted. The loyalty that Jonathan had didn't just extend to David and God. It was to his father, the king. A sad but true reality of life is that very good men often die or suffer due to the foolishness of others. And we certainly see that in the life of Jonathan through the foolishness of his father. This also gives hope to the righteous, because it's not in this life that we receive our final reward. Jonathan's independence and capacity for acting in his own responsibility were combined with devotion to his father. While holding his own opinion and taking his own course, he continued to honor his father, even to the cost of his life. Filial duty, that is, duty befitting a son, could not have been more severely tested than was that of Jonathan. But his conduct toward both his father and his friend are above criticism. Jonathan is a great example of a man who overcame his surroundings. Though close to his father, he refused to think and act like his father. Though in his father's house, he did not act upon the sins of his father. But in fact, he stands as a shining contrast to what Saul could have been. Circumstances or a broken home just do not condone sin. Ezekiel 18:14 says, he has a son who has observed all his father's sins which he committed, and observing does not do likewise. This describes Jonathan, does it not? Observed his father's sins, but he committed them not. Every bad quality we see in Saul, indecision, poor judgment, loving the praise of men, jealousy, envy, and compromise, are all lacking in Jonathan. Every one of them. In this man who had a poor example of a father, we see a lack of rebellion to God. In fact, we see a man that shines as an example of faith and courage. Jonathan was faithful to God and his friend David despite his father, and I would say despite his upbringing. There are so many people in this life that want to condone sin and crime and say it's from a broken family, it's from this or that. Jonathan came from a broken family. An abusive father who tried to kill him and his friend in his own dining room. And yet Jonathan displayed faith and courage. There's an application for today. We must honor our commitments and family relationships even when they are challenging. Ephesians 6:1-4 says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Recognize that our faithfulness can leave a lasting legacy. Even in difficult circumstances, we all as Christians want to hear from Jesus. Matthew 25:21, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I'll make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. We all want to hear those words. Let us encourage and build each other up to do that. Let Jonathan serve as an example of what true friendship is, that we love and support our brethren. He accepted a supporting role. Sometimes we're that supporting role because we need to be to a friend. Let him serve as an example that though you may do everything right, you may still suffer. You may not receive what you think is your reward in this life, but you must trust in God's promises. This world is not our home. It's not a lasting reward. But we trust in God and we look forward to his promises. And as the Hebrew writer wrote in Hebrews 11:13-16, we seek a better country. We seek that home, that city that God has gone to prepare for us. You know, it's sad to read about godly men dying. And yet what joy Jonathan brought to David in this life. It's hard not to wonder what life for David would have been if David had been with Jonathan by his side rather than Joab. Joab served Joab and David. Jonathan served God and David. I can't help but wonder. Maybe you don't like going down the what if road, but I can't help but wonder. What if? What would David's life and reign have been like? Would it have been more pleasant with a godly man at his right-hand side instead of Joab? We'll never know because the answer to that was not meant to be found. God did not choose Jonathan to be king, but Jonathan died with his father that day on Mount Gilboa with the Philistines. It hit David hard In 2 Samuel 1, 17 to 27, and I just want us to read a few of these passages and see the lament that David wrote. And he called it the Song of the Bow, and he taught it to all of Israel. His friend died, and he wanted them to know in this song, the Song of the Bow. And he says in verse 23, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle, Jonathan slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. David loved Jonathan. And in this Song of the Bow that he taught Israel to sing for generations to come, he could have said all kinds of horrible, mean, nasty things about King Saul, but he didn't. David again chose the high ground and to honor the Lord's anointed. And he tells them, O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel, and refers to him as mighty. How the mighty have fallen. As the early Christians accepted their fate when persecuted, so we must be ready to accept ours. Our reward is not in this life, but in heaven where Christ is preparing a home. We see that in John 14, 1-3. But I'm reminded of what Paul wrote in Romans 8:18. The sufferings of this present world are not to be compared to the glory that is to yet be revealed. The glory to come outweighs whatever suffering we have in this life. And I also take comfort in the fact that the story does not end here with Jonathan's death, for we know he and David are reunited and wait with the Lord to be with him forever, the Lord whom they both loved. And it's a glorious thought when we lose a loved one. We lost many loved ones, not only in 22 and 23, we lost loved ones last year in 24, and we're continuing the trend of losing loved ones this year. And we can take comfort in the thought that as Christians we'll be reunited with one another one day. We could all benefit from a friend like Jonathan. We could all be friends to others like Jonathan was to David. And that's the application for today. The takeaway that I hope you have is embrace courage. 1 Corinthians 16, 13-14 says, be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. We need to cultivate true friendships, and there's no better friends than those who are of like mind and like faith among the brotherhood. Jesus said in John 15:13, greater love is no one than this, that one lays down his life for his friends. We need to build friendships that are on trust and loyalty and love. Demonstrate loyalty. Stand by others even in challenging times. Act as peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God, as Jesus said in Matthew 5:9. And remain faithful. Not only we are called to remain faithful to God, faithful to Christ and our brothers, but also remain faithful to your friends. Honor your commitments. Leave a lasting legacy. Jesus said this to the church at Smyrna in Revelation 2:10. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison so that you will be tested, and you'll have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. As we reflect on the life of Jonathan, may we be inspired to live out these virtues daily. Let us seek God's strength to embody courage, build genuine friendships, to remain loyal, and stay faithful in all that we do. And if you're not a Christian with us this morning, we encourage you to become one. John 14:15 says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Christ has died and shed his own blood to pay your debt, and he wants to be your friend. And if you want to be his friend and love him, you need to obey his commandments and the steps that he has outlined in how to receive salvation. You need to repent of your sins, be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, and rise from the waters a new creature. Not living for yourself, but living for Jesus, who died and paid your debt of sin, and build that relationship with him as a friend. And if you are here this morning as a child of God who's not living the example that you ought to be for others to see, let your light shine. John 14:21 says this, He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will disclose myself to him. Remember who you are as a child of God, and remove whatever barrier it is that stands between you and God this morning. And we stand ready to assist you in whatever it is, the waters of baptism or the prayers of the congregation on your behalf. As we stand, as we pray with you and for you, you have but to come forward. Let it be known while we stand and sing.